Hi, Guy. Tonight we will enter such a night that even the color you dislike the most might not be what you want. Imagine that you are trekking through a medieval field. The snow creaks under your boots. Every breath is like a little ghost drifting before you. Your shoulders hurt under the armor that had absorbed too much cold, and your fingers twitched in the stiff leather gloves. The camp is just ahead, a cluster of flickering lights and a faint smell of wood smoke. You know you're just a few minutes away from a place where a soldier might break down after a day's march. You've reached the camp, and the firelight is like a fragile promise. Medieval armies marched with tents. Yes, but those tents were nothing like the waterproof nylon cocoons you have now. They are made by laying heavy canvas or thick linen on wooden poles, and sometimes with leather patches. You hid in the room, and the smell of damp wool, smoke and a tired body immediately hit your nose. The tent is very low, so you have to squat down. When you place yourself on the ground, your armor will clump together in the ground, or feel half frozen and half muddy, depending on whether it snowed or rained before. One mainstream fact to keep in mind is that battles in the Middle Ages often took place in late autumn or even late winter. It's not because generals like to punish their soldiers, but because wars seldom respect the weather calendar. The chroniclers of the 100 Years' War mentioned that soldiers dug in December and canvas tents hung beneath the ice. And it's not just northern Europe. The troops on the Balkan Peninsula or on the steppes faced cold night, and the wind could break the ropes of the tents like ropes. Here is a strange gossip. Some medieval soldiers swore that their best insulation material was not the fabric on their bodies, but the things they piled up under branches, hay, and even the remnants of battlefield shields, which were used to pull them up from the frozen ground. You can imagine it as a medieval version of a camping mat. The night attendants might neatly spread out the cut juncus grass in a layer, while the ordinary soldiers would frantically take out any dry bags that could fit into their cloaks. But historians are still debating this issue. How effective are these tents in allowing people to spend a real winter night? Some records show that the canvas was too thin, and snow blew in directly through the seams, soaking the soldiers until they had to squeeze around the fire outside. Others believe that as long as there are enough animal skins and cloaks, tents can provide astonishing insulation, especially when people are huddled side by side. This is a classic academic struggle. Are these shelters merely symbols of order or genuine antifreeze? You sat in the dim light, listening to the low voices of your companions around you. The wind was grasping the canvas wall, and each gust of wind made the rope creak and the stakes groan on the ground. You can feel the airflow swirling on the floor, making your ankles feel cold. Someone around you coughs deeply and loudly. You know that here, diseases spread faster than warmth. However, a tent is always better than the open air. You stretched your body, the cape draped over your shoulders, and the armor clumsily piled up beside your head as a pillow. Imagine that feeling the smoky smell of the fire outside still adheres to your cloak, the moldy moisture of the canvas presses into your nostrils, and the straw cuts through the thin fabric beneath your cheeks. You close your eyes, but sleep is like a stubborn mule. You tossed and turned, shivering, pulling your cloak tighter. At this moment, the cold air seeped in through the cracks like water. Somewhere outside, a guard was telling the time. Another night at the medieval camp has just begun. You move around in your own position, blinking your eyes in the dim light, realizing that the tent itself is both your refuge and your torture. The wall rose only a few feet and hung inward in the direction where the snow had accumulated on the canvas. Your breath wanders in the murky air, drifting towards the roof, where smoke stains reveal that fires or lanterns oft unturn fabrics black. Your hand moves along the surface. It feels rough, with damp condensation water. There is no waterproof coating and no ingenious seam tape. On the contrary, the entire structure is merely a shell to resist the wind, fragile yet surprisingly comfortable, for this is your only barrier. An obvious historical fact is that military tents in the Middle Ages were not luxury items, but logistical supplies. The commanders bought them here in long carriages, each pole and canvas bundle weighing dozens of pounds. The nobles claimed that the larger pavilion-style tents were brightly colored and sometimes even embroidered to indicate their status. Ordinary infantrymen had to make do with smaller and flatter bunkers, which could only barely accommodate 3 people huddled together in the dark. The difference between the two is as obvious as that between day and night. However, when winter presses its claws on you, even the smallest piece of canvas will make you feel like a fortress. Now let's take a look at an even stranger detail. Sometimes soldiers would stuff animal fat, or beeswax, into the seams of their tents, hoping to protect them from rain and snow. As a result, the faint, greasy smell stuck to the fabric and mixed with the smoke, making the entire room smell like a meat stand. This is not pleasant, but imagine how relaxed you would feel when a snowstorm roared down outside and raindrops rolled down instead of soaking your blanket. Soldiers are very practical animals. They would rather endure the stench than frostbite. However, in the long run, historians still disagree on whether these temporary shelters are sufficient. Some people think that tents only offer psychological comfort. This roof made the soldiers think they were safe, but diseases crept in quietly. Others, however, believe that when dozens of people are tightly huddled together, they form a pocket of body heat, which is sufficient to keep the temperature within a tolerable range. Without thermometers, without measurements, all we have is an exaggerated chronicle. Did the soldiers really sleep soundly? Or was that just a record on the surface of the pain? This problem lingers unlike the airflow under your ankle. You crouched lower, pulled your cloak tighter, and glanced at the temporary setting. Not too much. An old wooden box can be used as a stool to sit on. A mass of shields and spears reclined in the corner, occupying the dry spot where you wished to stretch your legs. As soon as the wind blows, the canvas will rustle like a drum, and the melted frost will drip onto your equipment. You curl up further inward, shrug your shoulders, and try to imagine a place without warmth. The sounds around you have a strange sense of intimacy. One of the companions had already started snoring, heavy and wet. Another one whispered, "Perhaps it's prayer. Perhaps it's a curse." Someone is coughing again. The voice was sharp and intermittent. Your own stomach is roaring, echoing softly in the darkness. Outside came the low sound of burning firewood, and the faint smell of smoke seeped into every fiber of your clothing. The tent was filled with a sense of feeling. Dampened cold air, stinging skin, persistent low humming, and a moving body. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine how fragile this fabric is. A single spark from the torch can turn the entire building into a pile of ashes. A gust of wind could pull it off the wooden stake and make it roll across the camp. However, when you breathe in the polluted air and listen to the low chorus of tired people, you also realize that this is survival. There is no such thing as primitive and perfect survival. That defective tent stands between you and the endless black cold outside the canvas wall. You pull the cloak closer to your body and feel the rough fibers scraping your chin. It's not charming at all, but the cloak is no longer just a piece of clothing. It is your mattress, blanket and shield at the same time. Wool is heavy, rough and a little itchy, but it is also a material that can tenaciously keep warm even when it is damp. You lay in bed, wrapping the edges of the clothes around your shoulders like cocoons, realizing that this garment might mean a night's rest and the torment of trembling until dawn. A definite historical fact is that soldiers in the Middle Ages relied heavily on cloaks, not only when marching but also when sleeping. Chroniclers often describe soldiers lying in cloaks, especially when it is impractical to carry extra bedding in war. Even senior officers, when forced to participate in long minus-term battles, sometimes do not use mattresses and bed sheets, but instead fold them in layers according to their cloaks as bedding. This is a universal tool for dressing during the day and sleeping at night. Here is a strange little detail. Some cloaks become very thick and oily due to repeated wearing, developing a natural water resistance, just like the wax jackets you see today. The soldiers joked that if placed in a corner, their cloaks could stand straight by themselves. It is not merely soiled. This is months of sweat, fat, spilled beer, and perhaps a little mutton fat. Disgusting. Sure, is it effective against light rain or melting snows? Surprisingly, yes. The cloak turned into an accidental waterproof jacket, and the second layer of skin aged like a strange stinky armor. Of course, scholars hold different opinions on how much comfort these cloaks can offer in cold temperatures. Some people believe that the thickness of the wool cloak does indeed provide insulation comparable to that of a blanket. Others countered that without outerwear like straw or fur, soldiers wrapped in cloaks would still lose their body heat to the cold ground beneath their feet. Is the cloak true protection, or merely an excuse to defend against natural damage? There are various opinions, and perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. You dragged your feet on the ground, feeling the hard frozen soil beneath your feet. The cloak alleviated some of the stinging pain, but every bone still ached, as if the soil itself were squeezing upwards. You curl up into a tighter ball and press your knees against your chest, because this is the best way to keep warm, to decompressed, stored and kept around you. Others do the same. The shape beneath the wall folds becomes hard to distinguish. Men turned into bundles of fabric, with only occasional coughs and noises to prove that they were still alive. The air is filled with dampness. When you exhale, your breath condenses inside the cloak, making the fabric wet. You still pressed your face against the crease, inhaling the faint smell of lanolin and smoke. Although it's not very comfortable, this is home for tonight. When someone moves around you, their cloak rubs against yours. At that moment, this touch feels like a warm comfort. All the animals here attach themselves to their own little sheep islands, but these islands come together to form a crowded survival archipelago. Describe this scene more carefully. The brown, grey and faded blue cloak had tattered edges and the hem was stiff from old mud. Every story tells of battles, road marches and storms. They are blankets embroidered with history, even though that history smells like sweat. When you lie there wrapped in your own stinky wool fragments, you realize that you are no different from the thousands of soldiers before you. The cloak allowed them to live long enough to keep fighting. You hope they can keep you alive tonight. You turn sideways, grasping the cloak tightly, and suddenly bumped into another person. There is no privacy here. The tent is small, and intimacy is needed for survival. You hear the slow rhythm of breathing, the rustling sound of wool rubbing against each other, and you feel the faint heat emitted by the person lying a few inches away. You approached without thinking, because warmth is a kind of currency, and the only way to gain more is to share the little bit you already have. A straightforward fact is that soldiers in the Middle Ages usually slept in groups, shoulder to shoulder and hip to hip, forming a human crucible. For instance, the chroniclers of the Crusades mentioned that people lay in piles like dogs to escape the cold desert nights. In the frozen forests of northern Europe, the entire team was crammed into narrow tents because they knew that no soldier could endure the cold alone. This is practical rather than emotional. It is the only available insulating material when firewood is scarce and blankets are scarce. There is a strange little flower edge here. In some armies, soldiers give each other nicknames based on their own sleeping habits. People who snore too loudly can be called bellows, while those who throw and kick are called mules. These names even spread outside the tent. A little reminder whenever possible, suffering can turn into humor. After all, if you can't laugh at the pain of sleeping with a comrade who doesn't take a bath, what else can you do? However, historians remain puzzled as to whether this collective sleep cultivated comradeship or bred resentment. Some people believe that it has established a bond of brotherhood, and after experiencing such a close relationship, soldiers trust each other even more. Others, however, counter that compared with warmth, continuous proximity would more effectively lead to the worsening of irritation, the spread of lice and a bad temper. Does it unite men or wear them down? The answers from these sources are self-contradictory. When you move in the dark, you will notice the uneven distribution of heat. The side you leaned against your companion soon became warm, while your exposed back was as cold as a stone. So you clumsily rolled up again and bumped into another person. Now you are sandwiched between two bodies, each radiating a little warmth into your bones. Yes, it was very uncomfortable, but gradually your trembling lessened. The smell is pungent. Sweat, smoke, leather, unwashed feet. But you accepted it, for you would rather smell your neighbor's scent than feel the cold blade cutting through your ribs. The noise is constant. Someone snores like a saw, making the canvas creak with every breath. Another person coughed with his sleeve. A murmuring prayer drifted in the darkness. You could even hear a dry, soft, almost hysterical laugh, as if a soldier found his pile of dogs too absurd and unbearable. Close your eyes and immerse yourself in the rhythm of coexisting. Imagine the scene seen from above. A pile of cloaks and limbs were angled up together, like a nest of hibernating animals. Due to the pressure from the people inside, the canvas wall protruded slightly outward. Outside, the wind holds onto the rope, but here, at its strongest, you are buffered by a living wall made of meat and fabric. You are not alone, not tonight. Whether you like it or not, survival has turned you into a part of the collective organism. Breathing, sweating, trembling in an imperfect harmony. You silent pressed your forehead against your neighbor's coarse wool cloak. Warmth is not enough to completely drive away the cold, but it can relieve the pain in your bones. As you gradually move towards intermittent rest, you realize that you are sleeping very close. Sharing calories is not merely a strategy. This is a necessary condition and truth for survival in the medieval camp. You shouldn't have spent this night alone. Fire is the beating heart of the camp. You can hear it before you see it. Crackling sounds, low crackling sounds, the occasional hissing of damp wood. Step out of the tent door and you'll find it right there. A circle of fiery reddened orange embers. Several pieces of wood are leaning against each other, just like old people supporting each other. The flame doesn't jump high. Not tonight. On the contrary, they crouched very low, ignoring any leftovers that the soldiers could pick up. Twigs, or even fragments of a broken car. There is very little firewood, always very little. Everyone here knows that keeping the fire burning all night is both a risk and a danger. A definite historical fact is that in the Middle Ages, armies relied on campfires, not only for cooking but also for survival in winter. They deliberately placed the fire in the center of a small group of tents, so that although it was weak, the flames and warmth could radiate outward into the canvas walls. Archaeological excavations of the old camp have revealed black soil patches in repetitive circles, which are evidence of countless fires meticulously tended to during arduous battles. Without them, the cold would be more lethal than swords. So there is an unknown detail here. Men often try to carry fire with them, really. They would ladle the burning embers into earthenware jars, or even knuckle helmets and place them beneath layers of ashes, so that they could be reignited at dawn without having to strike flint in the frozen air. Imagine you hold a smoldering pot in your arms like a baby, trying hard not to burn yourself, but you know that the embers are your ticket to warmth tomorrow. The soldiers passed these glowing jars around like treasures, just like the fireplaces they carried with them during marches. However, scholars are still debating whether the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. Fires inside or near the tent make sparks to come into contact with the canvas, especially since most medieval tents were covered with oil stains left by smoke and dirt. Some people believe that the commander completely prohibited the use of open flames in the shelter, forcing men to rely only on their body temperature. Others, however, believe that even within thin walls, small rods are very common and they are carefully placed and cared for. Is this a common practice, or a risky gamble taken by a few reckless people? The written records are contradictory, leaving us with smoke, but no clear flame. You are sitting by the fire now. Your face is warm, but your back is cold. This is the cruel trick of fire. It won't warm up everything at once. Stretch out your hands forward until your palms tingle, and then quickly rub them together. The sunlight makes every wrinkle on your skin glow with a red light. Your cloak now smells more like smoke. Wool soaked in ash can be stuck for several weeks. You bring your boots closer together, hoping to dry the mud, but be careful not to burn the leather. Around you, people are whispering to each other. It's a kind of half-minus awake, half-minus asleep shit that comes out of the mouth when exhaustion has dulled all sharp thoughts. The flames crackled and the sparks rose like vortices, shooting straight up into the black sky. Every spark vanished, just like a star vanishing without a trace. A cigarette curls into your nose, making your eyes shed tears, but you still got closer, because heat is life. Behind you, someone put on a cloak and moaned. Another person stirred the embers with a stick, emitting more light from the fallen wood. Fire, like a hungry animal, requires constant attention. If no one feeds it, it will sulk and die before dawn. Imagine the strange rhythm this creates in camp life. The soldiers not only had to take turns on duty, but also on fire, stumbling out of the tent and throwing things onto another branch. You imagine the crunching footsteps on the snow. A man's hand rubbed against the scalding embers, cursing softly. Sometimes, a log would collapse with a snap, giving off a burst of light that briefly illuminated the outlines of the tent, the horses and the exhausted pale faces. For a moment, the camp looked like a living painting, with shadows dancing, breath steaming, and eyes twinkling in the light. You can almost hear the fire speaking, a crackling language. It tells you that warmth is fleeting and survival is fragile. Everyone crammed here is connected by this fragile circle of light. Fire can also make you drowsy. Its rhythm, the warmth on your face, and a hypnotic glow blur the edges of everything. But you know you can't stay too long. If you fall asleep by the fire, you might wake up in the smoke, or not at all. So you go back to the tent again, taking your hot ghost with you. Your cloak still carries the warmth of memory, although it vanished quickly in the darkness. When you crawled back to your corner, the people inside were in an uproar. You curled up again, your knees touching your chest, your cloak tightly wrapped, imagining the embers shining just a few feet away. The faint light outside was what the entire camp relied on for survival. Without it, there would only be silence, snowflakes, and endless cold nights, devouring everything. Now, think about the strange balanced firepower used by medieval soldiers. If there is too little fire, people will freeze stiff. Too many fires and tents were burned down. Coupled with the temptation that the enemy can see the light from miles away, commanders must decide how much risk is worth taking. Fire may protect you from frost, but it may also expose your location to vigilant scouts. You imagine the commanders weighing these options, their faces covered and their voices deep. Should they keep the fire burning or leave their people quietly in the dark? The answer often depends on despair. In some besieged cities, fire is completely forbidden because the fear of being discovered is more terrifying than the fear of the cold. People, without any light, huddled together, ignoring the cold bread and cursing in low voices. In some other battles, survival was more important than secrecy. Dozens of fires were set on the entire camp, sending smoke columns into the sky, as if sending signals to the gods. No matter what choice was made, the fire shaped every soldier's night and every hour of restless sleep. Tonight, when you hear the wind beating against the canvas wall, you will realize how much hope you have placed on the crackling sound outside. The tent may be fragile, the cloak may be itchy, the colts on your body may stink, but fire is different. This fire is full of vitality. This is the only thing that can respond to the cold, the only thing that can tell you, yes, you might survive tonight. Close your eyes and let the memory of its glow linger behind your eyelids. When the embers made a faint hissing sound outside, guarding the camp with their fragile light, I fell asleep uneasily. You woke up in the middle of the night and for a moment didn't know what had woken you up. Then you feel it, the shrill friction on your cheeks, and the faint itch on your arms. You made a slight change and realized that what lay beneath your feet was not just soil, but something coarser, heavier and warmer. Fur, the skin of animals, serves as a thin buffer between your body and the merciless ground. A straightforward fact is that soldiers in medieval Europe often relied on animal skins as bedding. The skins of sheep, goats and even deer were spread on the floor of the tent to provide some insulation. In the wealthier armies, knights had furs, foxes, wolves, and even beavers to soften the ground and keep it warm. The poorer soldiers made do with any animal skin fragments they could pick up, whether tanned or not, sometimes with a pungent smell of animal fat. Archaeologists discovered leather shards at the temporary camp. These leather shards had hardened over time and were remnants of these, once indispensable sleep tools. Here is an interesting gossip. This is well known. In some particularly harsh battles, soldiers would peel off the skins of freshly slaughtered animals, sleep on them, and at the same time, their bodies would still be giving off heat. Imagine lying on a half-hot, half-blood animal skin, trying to ignore the smell because you know it might protect your toes from frostbite. How embarrassing that would be. Some chroniclers even joke that men borrowed warmth from the beasts they ate, as if dinner and bedding were two parts of the same animal. It's grey and practical. You wouldn't want to explain it on the lawn at home, but historians still disagree on just how widely fur was used. Some people believe that fur is a luxury item that only knights and commanders can purchase, and ordinary people can only rely on straw or cloaks. Others point out that there are records showing that soldiers wore distributed sheepskins as part of their campaign supplies, which indicates that even for male servants, animal skins were common. Is this a standard life minus saving tit or a lucky accident when livestock are nearby? The source of the information makes us guess. Just like the low splashing of flames at night, you move again, pressing your palm flat on the animal skin. It feels roughened, its hair stings your skin, but it does keep a certain degree of warmth. Beneath it, the ground was still giving off a cold, but not as fiercely. Fur is like a comforting whisper, reminding you that you are not lying directly on frosten soil. You took a deep breath and smelled the scent of earth, musk, and a hint of smoke, as someone was trying to dry it too quickly. This is unpleasant, but it anchors you. Around you, people are staggering in their sleep, their cloaks rustling and their bodies moving. A person pulled his fur closer and curled up on it like a dog in a kennel. Some have nothing, and you hear their teeth quivering in the darkness. You almost pitied him. That in this world, compassion is a dangerous luxury. You held onto that piece of skin tightly, as if it were a treasure. Think of those tactile details. The gear-easiness of the semi-minest and leather, the way the fur rubs against your cheeks as you roll around, and the moisture that seeps in from under the tent when the snow melts. After a few days, you can almost feel that the fur has hardened, coagulated by dust and sweat, but it still remains because there is no better substitute. Comfort is relative. Survival is absolute. The camp outside was rustling in the wind. The fire has been extinguished, and the embers are faintly shining. The canvas on your head trembles with every gust of wind. You close your eyes again, your cheeks pressed against the fur, wondering if the smell of fur will still linger on your body when you wake up tomorrow, or if you won't wake up at all. But tonight, this fragment of an animal's past life won't freeze you to death. That's enough. When you wake up, the first thing you notice is your feet. They felt swelling, numbness, tingling and dull pain in their toes, which refused to subside. You have never taken off your boots. There wasn't any last night, nor was there any the night before last. Do you know why? If you do this, you may never wear it again. The frozen leather was as hard as wood, the shoelaces were frozen, and the toes were so swollen that they couldn't be squeezed in. So you keep them on all the time and sleep in the boots you wore during the march. An undeniable fact is that soldiers in the Middle Ages often slept without tying their shoelaces. Historians describe that men are too afraid of frostbite or sudden attacks to take the risk of going barefoot. Boots, even those with rough leather studs, can not only protect you from the terrain but also keep you warm at night. Taking them off in cold weather might mean waking up to find them frozen solid or your feet are frostbitten and beyond repair. It's better to endure the stench and pain than to risk losing your toes in winter. This is the strange part. Soldiers sometimes stuff straw, moss or even wool into their boots as insulating materials, layering them inside just like primitive socks. The result was the boots constantly puffed up, squeaking as they walked, and there was damp rotten flesh everywhere, but the heat they stored was just enough to prevent frostbite. Some people even swear that fat, yes, animal fat smeared in it helps to keep out the cold. Imagine that you put your feet into that dirty and greasy stuff and then say it's very comfortable. It's strange, yes, but in despair, practicality is always more important than dignity. Of course, scholars are still striving to address the issue of whether this approach is sustainable. Some people believe that wearing boots frequently can worsen wrenched feet, just as was the case in trenches centuries ago, where the feet would swell, blister and draw due to lack of air. Others think that the soldiers just took turns putting on shoes, drying one pair by the fire while wearing another, although this assumes a large number of boots that the poorer soldiers might never have. Is wearing boots all the time a common pain or a burden mainly for the lower castes? The evidence is still incomplete. Just like half-minus dried skin, you twist your toes, trying to bring life back to them, feeling the hardened leather resistance. Your socks, if you could call them damp wool wraps, are wet and stiff because of sweat. A foul smell wafted upwards, pungent and sour, mixed with smoke and unwashed corpses. Everyone smells the same, so no one will complain. You bring your boots clenched to the gradually warming fire, hoping that the leather will become a little softer. The heat scorched your soles for a moment and then vanished around you. Others do the same. The boots were squeezed at the edge of the embers, as if offered as sacrifices to some strange god. A man complained that his heels felt very dark. Another person cursed the blisters on his arch. The third person smiled and said that if such a miracle happened, he would be willing to sell his boots for a hot bath. You also chuckled softly. For what else could you do? Boots may be prisons, but they are also lifelines. Without them, what you lose is not just comfort. You will lose the ability to march, fight, and survive. Imagine the sound of this scene. The stiff leather stream, the crackling of half-run shoeless, the groans of men taking off their boots, then putting them back on a few minutes later. You can almost hear the squeaking of the damp woolen, the hissing of the boots that are too close to being scorched by the fire. The entire tent was filled with the smell of wet leather, and a pungent odor seeped into the cloak and hair. This was very unpleasant, but in this frozen camp, the unpleasantness was far better than the frost-bitten silence. You sat down, your boots still fastened tightly, and your toes huddled together like reluctant neighbors. The leather pressed against your ankle, stinging your skin, but you still accepted it. The choice is very simple. A few hours of comfort, or another day to live. You close your eyes and wrap your feet. You understand why soldiers in the Middle Ages never really took off their boots. Their fate remains unknown, step by step, night after night, until morning comes again. In the tense and stale air, your breathing became blurred. You reached for the flask beside you. The liquid swayed quietly, full of hope. You threw it back, and the burning sensation spread along your throat, temporarily dispelling your trembling. It doesn't matter whether it's me or something more pungent from local hand-miners distilled products. In the cold weather, the soldiers called it medicine. During those happy minutes you believed them. The historical fact is that alcohol was the staple food in medieval camps, not only for pleasure but also as a necessity. Diluted alcohol, light beer, or any fermented beverage at hand is safer than drinking unclean water. On cold nights, soldiers used it as a primitive antifreeze, numbing their bodies and minds and allowing sleep to take its place. Chroniclers describe men drinking alcohol to strengthen their hearts, which is a polite way of saying it, referring to the calories from gulping down a liquid before collapsing in the dark. Now it's a bizarre anecdote. Some soldiers believe that strong alcohol can actually prevent frostbite, claiming that it can warm the blood. They would rub strong liquor on their skin and even soak their socks in beer before putting them on. Believe that alcohol is like a magical shield. Of course it did not play such a role, but only faith can offer comfort. Imagine this absurdity. Staggering into your tent, with beer dripping from your socks and the smell of the tavern floor emanating from you, you swore that you would wake up because of this and become even more toasted. However, historians are still debating the role that alcohol played in it. Some people believe that this does help boost morale and curb despair during the long campaign. Others have pointed out that drunkenness makes camps vulnerable and people slow to respond to sudden attacks or fires. Is it a blessing for survival or a burden disguised as warmth? This debate was like a pot stewed on low embers, never boiling to a definite extent. You put down the flask, your lips still stinging, and then exhale. The heat transfer is uneven. Your chest glows, but your fingers are still stiff and your toes are still frozen in the boots. Around you, other men also drink alcohol. The soft gurgling sound from the flask broke the darkness. A person hummed a half-drunk song, his voice hoarse. Another person laughed dryly, wiping his mouth with his dirty sleeve. For the third time, he let out a deep sigh and leaned against the canvas, as if the wine alone had softened the rough wall. The tent was filled with the smell of malt liquor sour, yeast-blackened, with a hint of sweetness. It mixes with smoke and sweat, creating a fragrance that adheres to the cloak and hair. You can almost taste it both in the air and in a flask. It cannot completely eliminate the cold, but it can make the body believe that warmth is possible. And this kind of illusion is often what a soldier needs to fall into an uneasy sleep. But this is also dangerous. You know, if you drink too much, your body will become loose, your vigilance will wane, the fire outside will go out, the guards will doze off, the enemy will approach quietly, and you will never notice. More than once, the tent was recorded to be set on fire because people fainted while holding flasks, and the embers fell where they shouldn't. The line between warmth and destruction is thin, and each swallow makes it even more blurred. You lean back in your chair, and the wine hums gently in your veins. Your eyelids are getting heavier and heavier, and the cold sensation is not as sharp as before, as if someone had blunted their edges with a knife. You know it's false that your body is still dissipating heat, but you still insist on this comfort. You curled up in your cloak, stuffed the flask against your chest and closed your eyes. Now, malt liquor has done its job. It gives you a warm illusion, enough to make you feel sleepy. Before the cold, the itch will wake you up. At first it was just a little itchy on your neck. You scratched it half asleep and half awake. But then it would spread a calling sensation on your scalp, pinching behind your knees and biting clearly at the contact point between the fabric and the skin on your waist. You moan gently, dragging your nails on the fabric of your coat, knowing clearly in your heart what had brought you into this tent. Lice, an obvious historical fact, is that soldiers in the Middle Ages often lived with lice, just as they often lived with cloaks and swords. Chronicles of the Crusades, the 30 Years' War, and even smaller regional campaigns all describe the army as being so rampant that people joke that their camp companions are as loyal as their brothers. Clothes are rarely washed and water is scarce, but the warmth in the crowded tent provides them with a perfect breeding environment. Here is a strange detail that you can't laugh at. Some soldiers gave their lice names. Imagine it, sitting by the fire, grasping your own shirt, and declaring that the little fat parasite you just caught is brave Henry or stubborn Margaret. This is a kind of black humor, a way to deal with the endless crawling and biting. Some people even hold competitions, throwing lice on the warm ground to see whose lice can run the fastest. Boredom and pain give birth to strange games. But historians are still debating how destructive lice were to the health of medieval armies. Some people say that pests are just a nuisance and unpleasant, but they can survive. Others, however, pointed out that the spread of diseases, such as typhus carried by lice, might destroy the entire camp more quickly than enemy arrows. Are lice nearly itchy dreamers in the same bed or silent pillars wearing woolen stitches? The evidence has us struggling to find the answer. You put on your cloak and put your fingers into the collar. Its fabric is very rough, full of sand and sweat, but beneath it, you can feel the small protrusions of lice stuck to the seams. Pinch one, roll it between your fingertips until it gently bursts, and then wipe your hands on the ground. Around you, others are doing same things, scratching, muttering and cursing softly. This sound is constant, just like the rustling of a mouse in dry straw. The smell in the tent was already the odor of sweat and smoke, and with the faint smell of iron from scratching, you would realize that this discomfort was incurable tonight. Taking a bath is not an option. Clean clothes do not exist. All you can do is endure the feeling of crawling. Even if you want to sleep, this feeling will cause your skin to twitch. Imagine this kind of pain more carefully. A man was wriggling on the ground, changing his cloak and muttering to himself, as if he were fighting an invisible enemy. Another person lifted his shirt in front of the firelight, squinting his eyes to search for the pale spots stuck to it like stubborn seeds. The third man shook his woolen hood, and a swarm of lice scattered like grains of sand. Yes, it's disgusting, but it's also quite moral. It's perfectly normal. No one raises their head when scratching. You sighed, resigned yourself to fate, and stuffed yourself into the cloak, even though you knew it would only bring pests closer to your skin. Itching can make it hard for you to rest, but fatigue overcomes the discomfort. Your eyes closed again, and crawling became part of the humming background of camp life. Through brook-like canvas, the coughing of the neighbor, and the hissing of the wind outside. In the world of soldiers in the Middle Ages, even parasites were part of survival. The scratching sound gradually faded into the background, and eventually you heard different sounds. Low voices, low footsteps, and the transformation of armor in the darkness. You should know that it's not just your tent that is full of uneasy people everywhere. The camp itself never really sleeps. Someone has to stay alert, watching the firelight, the horizon, the flickering of the enemy's torches, or the shadow of a raider approaching quietly. This is the rotation of defenders. This is the rhythm of the night. Whether you like it or not, you are a part of it. A definite historical fact is that in the Middle Ages, armies divided the night into several shifts. allowing some people to take turns staying awake while others slept. The number of watches varies, sometimes 3 and sometimes 4, depending on the commander's discipline. Historians of the 100 Years' War mention the first and the last Vigny, and the last Vigny was always the most terrifying because it meant you would wake up from your sleep and endure the coldest and darkest moment just before dawn. Without these rotations, a camp might be completely raided. The fire was put out and the soldiers were slaughtered on their beds. Here is a strange gossip. Guards usually carry not only weapons but also small mallets or horns, which are devices used to scare away intruders or prevent themselves from dozing off. Imagine wrecking through a frozen camp, stomping your boots to keep your blood flowing, and occasionally bumping to sticks together like a solo percussion band, so that your eyelids won't give you away. Some guards sang in a low voice, repeating the lyrics non-stop like a lullaby. But historians are still debating just how strict these watches were. Some reports have described strict discipline, with people being severely punished for sleeping at work. Others, however, believe that there is a lack of rotation, especially in smaller battles where guards often rely on dogs or sheer luck to sound the alarm. Is guard duty a solid survival system, or a fragile hope that someone will wake up at the right time? As usual, the truth may lie somewhere between these two extremes. Now imagine yourself waking up from a half-asleep state, with a cape draped over your shoulders, staggering out of the tent. The air outside is slapping against your face, icy cold. Your breath bursts forth, like smoke in the darkness. The flames burned very low, and the embers emitted a faint light, just enough to make the shadows dance among the dense dents. Holding your spear, cold metal and cold wood, you began to patrol slowly around the camp. The ground beneath your feet creaks. Every few steps you stop, listen attentively, and try hard to hear the groans of the wind and the occasional snoring from the tent. Somewhere, a horse is treading on rattan and shaking its mane to resist the cold. Your toes hurt, your knees are stiff, but you keep moving forward, because stillness is death. Take a look at the fire every few minutes to make sure it doesn't sink too low. If that's the case, you'll have to switch to more wood, even though you know the rate at which the wood supply is decreasing is faster than anyone admits. The camp in the evening has its own music. The canvas pieces rustled. The men coughed in unison, like a strange choir. Fires suddenly burst out, spewing out sparks. Further ahead lies silence, deep and endless. This silence makes you realize how vulnerable you are under the vast sky. You peek into the darkness, hoping to see a pair of shining eyes staring at you, even though usually there is nothing. However, your brain is still playing tricks, and every shadow becomes a threat. You walked back around the tent. As you passed by, you heard some sounds. 2 men were whispering and dreaming loudly in their sleep. One of them murmured a woman's name, another curse, as if fighting against an invisible enemy. You glanced inside and saw the body beneath the cloak moving, a pile of exhausted forms. It's up to you to keep the night peaceful. It is very heavy. You stomped your foot again, trying to remind yourself that being clear-headed was your only responsibility now. Some nights, the rotation is like a thin chain. You count the stars. You recite the prayer. You muttered to yourself. To stay awake, you can hardly remember anything. And other nights the cold itself is enough to make you open your eyes wide. Every time your eyelids droop, the cold will bite you. Just think about how many generations of soldiers have done the same thing before you, wandering in the darkness, cursing the frost and praying for the dawn. This rhythm is ancient and can be traced back to before memory. Finally, another soldier took your place. His cloak was wrapped very tightly. His eyes blurred. He nodded without saying a word. You handed him the spear, muttered about the fire, and then slipped back to the tent. Warmth is relative. Compared with the cold air outside, this feeling is just like walking into a steaming hot bathtub. You curled up in your own position, your limbs stiff but grateful, with your clump draped over your shoulders. You realize that once again falling into a deep sleep, the rotation of the guard is not merely about monitoring the enemy. This is to keep the flame burning, maintain a stable pace in the camp, and prevent fear from overwhelming everyone all at once. Without it, the night would fall into chaos. With it, even if most people are lost in dreams, the camp can still breathe. You don't remember falling asleep again after it was your turn to be on duty, but you do remember those sounds. They come and go in your half-awake dream, as soft as a lullaby, yet rough due to exhaustion. A fragment of a person humming a song on your left. The words vanished, and only the melody spread in the low, humming vibration on the canvas wall. Another low prayer, murmuring over and over again, until it blends into the rhythm of your breathing. This is a strange comfort. You have never truly felt lonely in this tent, even if you close your eyes. A straightforward historical fact is that soldiers in the Middle Ages often sang together at night, which could both kill time and boost morale. Chronicles from the battles of France and the Holy Land describe people gathering around a fire, chanting hymns or folk songs, depending on who was listening. These songs are not just for entertainment. They are shields against despair and a way to remind each other sound can transcend the cold. Here is a strange gossip. Soldiers sometimes mumble to sleep by loudly reciting recipes. A cooking lullaby. Imagine lying on the frozen ground, your teeth quivering, and hearing your tent companion whispering about roast goose, fig stew, or a greased pie. Its absurdity made people laugh for a long time and temporarily made them forget the pain that tortured them. Some people even claim that naming dishes can prevent hunger, as if words alone could fill one's stomach. Scholars are still debating what role this kind of night-time chatting played in it. Some people believe that this is a conscious attempt to build unity by sharing stories and songs to establish connections. Others, however, believe that this is merely a tense noise, a way to drown out the silence. Otherwise, people might remind themselves of how close they are to death. Is it friendship or fear? The records hint at both situations, leaving us with echoes that are hard to determine. You put on your cloak and listened to the expansion and weakening of the sound. A snore joined the chorus, heavy and low, while another voice whispered all of song. You didn't know if it was for everyone or to commemorate it. You think of the crackling fire outside, the wind beating against the canvas, and then realize that in this thin-walled shelter, sound is another kind of insulation, not physical warmth, but a vulnerable psychological heat that can keep despair away from the harbor. The tent was filled with whispers. Some moaned while others smiled slightly. Someone cursed under a low voice. Between the lines, everything is blurry, with meaningless syllables mixed with the sounds of limbs dragging and scratching. Two strangers. This might sound confusing, but to you, it's just a blanket. Every sound proves that life here is still beating. Despite the cold, people are still breathing and dreaming. Close your eyes tight-trimmed. Let the sound carry you. The hum of the faintly remembered hymn wafted in the corner amid the whispered laughter of people telling jokes. These two are strangely merged together, both sacred and secular, sharing the same space without conflict. Do you know how many generations of soldiers before you might have heard the same soundtrack? Snoring, singing, praying and cursing mingled together, enveloping the smoke-filled air. Depict it clearly. The men huddled under their cloaks, their faces shaded and their lips moving half-awake. That person repeatedly traced the symbol of the cross. The other one exposed a plate like tail. Another one hung from his chapped lips. No one can conduct this choir. It just happened. Spontaneous and unplanned. Just like the fire outside, the sound flickered, the light shone, and eventually turned to ashes. Where you finally drift again and are hypnotized by the strange mixture of songs and sizes, you understand this is how medieval soldiers made space for themselves in unbearable nights. They can't drive away the cold, but they can feel the silence. These voices wove a powerful web, strong enough to suppress despair until the next morning. You wake up blinking in the middle of the night, clearly realizing that your sleep has been interrupted. First of all, shortly after the vigneting, you fell into a heavy sleep, hypnotized by the dimming glow of the fire and the murmuring sounds around you. Now, just a few hours later, you find yourself completely awake, staring at the dim canvas ceiling and listening to the sounds of people walking, coughing and moving in the darkness. It feels very strange. This interruption, just like sleep, is neatly divided into two halves. A straightforward historical fact is that in the Middle Ages, segmented sleep was very common. Scholars who study life in the pre-industrial era call it the first sleep and the second sleep. People will sleep for a few hours, Wake up naturally around midnight. Spend 1 or 2 hours chatting, praying, watching over the fire, or even visiting neighbors, and then go back to rest. The soldiers' intentions also experienced the same rhythm, although for them, this rhythm was not so much out of choice as out of need. Cold, noise and constant duty demands divide their nights into large chunks. Here is a strange gossip. Some people claim that waking up at midnight is the best time to tell stories, and they share strange tales about ghosts and omens. Imagine lying in a smoke-filled tent with your eyes half open, and your neighbor whispering in your ear that ghosts are wandering the battlefield. Dead people are bumping into the tent walls, and saints are appearing in your dreams to offer protection. This sounds like a folk tale about a campfire, but in the darkness it becomes almost credible. Some soldiers even swore that they saw glowing figures near the fire at night. But whether it was ghosts or smoke playing tricks, you'll never know. However, historians are still debating whether segmented sleep can really help people rest. Some people say that this is natural, as the body adapts to the cycle formed by firelight and darkness. Others, however, believe that this leaves the soldiers forever exhausted and unable to fully recover before dawn, forcing them to resume their march. Is sleep interruption an adaptation or another cruel act imposed on a tired body? The debate continues, and there is no definite conclusion except that the man managed to endure the fact. He moved your cloak a little, pulled it tighter and listened to the sounds around you. The sound rang out again. Someone is praying softly. Another person moaned and muttered, perhaps telling a half-awake companion about a dream. The person closest to you let out a deep sigh and whispered about food, fresh bread, grilled meat, anything would do, except for the not fresh crust of bread waiting for him in the morning. He can almost taste it, the feast of imagination, even if your stomach crawls in the empty protest. The fire outside has turned to ashes, but you can still see a faint light through the gaps of the tent. A guard walked by, his boots creaking in the snow and the butt of his gun rhythmically tapping on the frozen ground. Further away, a horse gently swayed the frost on its mane. The entire world was trapped, sandwiched between the deep darkness and the still distant dawn. You realize that this is a final moment, a pause in the soldiers' daily work, where they are neither fully awake nor fully asleep. You put the cloak over your head to block the wind and enter a semi-awake state of thought. Perhaps this is when secrets come to light, when men whisper about their departed families and the fears they will never admit during the day. Perhaps this is the time when the curse is more likely to overflow, targeting the commander, the enemy, and even God himself, for he allows such pain to occur. When half asleep and half awake, when thoughts are scattered and unprepared, language is freer. Imagine the tent as a quiet and active beehive. Some people slipped into the snow outside to relieve themselves, some poked around on the fire, and others whispered to each other, confusing fact with legends. The canvas wall glowed slightly in the cold light. Shadows bend and stretch as people move. This was a period of time that was both strange and intimate, with exhaustion interwoven with odd alertness. Ultimately, the rhythm changed again. The sound gradually faded away, and the movements slowed down. The men rolled back into their cloaks, put their hands over their heads, and snores rang out one after another until the second sound of sleep was heard in the tent again. You feel your eyelids drooping and your body sinking into the soil. Despite the bone-chilling cold, it couldn't stop the welling up of sleepiness. When you fall asleep again, you realize that soldiers in the Middle Ages were not just fighting against enemies on the battlefield. They struggled with the structure of the night itself, its intermittent rhythm, constant distractions, and the unstable balance between wakefulness and rest. However, just like you do now, they find ways to close their eyes and slip back into the darkness, believing that a second sleep might be enough for them to get through the dawn. When you wake up again, it's not the itching of lice or the howling of the wind, but the steady breathing of the people around you. In the dim light, you notice that something always pricks you. Not all and bedding are the same. The man opposite you, a night watchman, tossed and turned in his sleep, wrapped in thick woolen fur, while you lay on a rough canvas with a faint smell of gant. Status will not vanish in the darkness. He curls up beside you, snoring comfortably, while you are shivering. A clear historical fact. is that the quality of sleep equipment for knights and ordinary infantry varies greatly. The wealthier people could afford lined cloaks, feather-filled trays, or exquisite blankets pulled by servants. Chronicles record that the nobles slept in embroidered pavilions, which had carpets and pillows. Meanwhile, the ordinary soldiers had nothing but their own cloaks, some strand perhaps of blankets shared by 2 or 3 people. Comfort has become another class privilege. Here is a strange gossip. In some battles, the knights insisted on bringing brightly colored bedding to the battlefield, red, blue, and even with the patterns of their family's emblems. This is not merely for comfort. This is for display. Imagine being half dead from the cold, and then seeing a noble's tent glowing with silk, as if a festival pavilion had fallen into an ocean of suffering. This is both infuriating and absurd, just like taking a feather bed to sleep beside the battlefield. But historians are still debating just how wide this bay was. Some people believe that the tents at night are true shelters, lined with blankets and layers of bedding, and the infantrymen can only barely survive the night. Others, however, believe that the gap is not that large, as supply shortages often led the nobility into rough improvisation as well. Will the knights never be affected by suffering, or will the battle eventually torment everyone equally? The evidence is chaotic because of the prejudice against who wrote about the nobility themselves. You glanced at your tent companion's fur again, feeling both envious and helpless. The fur was faintly shining in the firelight seeping through the crack of the door, while your own cloak was getting off a smell of smoke and dampness. Your neighbor is snoring gently, immersed in comfort, as if they were in another world. Around you, others are moving uneasily, pulling their thin cloaks tighter. Some people murmur to themselves in their sleep, and their teeth even tremble when they are unconscious. The smell inside the tent also marked the divergence. The bedding at night carried a faint scent of herbs or oil, which might have been something his servant used to cover his fur with musk. You exude the smell of sweat, grease and aged beer. You can almost sense the difference from the air. This inequality is not only reflected in warmth, it permeates every feeling. Imagine the camp at dawn. The pavilions of the nobles stood tall, brightly colored, with straw stuffed in them. 2 thin people hung down nearby. The contrast is sharp, even bizarre. Tourists might mistake this field for a strange village, where a carnival tent stands beside a whirlpool. But in fact, the 2 stand side by side, because the war has pushed all classes into the same quagmire, although never under the same conditions. You rolled over, pulled your cloak tighter, and reminded yourself that survival is not measured by softness or softness. Comfort does not necessarily guarantee endurance. Sometimes, those with fewer blankets learn how to squeeze together, how to endure, and how to hold on to a little warmth. You are breathing in the smoky and sour air. Let the uneven breathing sound wash you away and drift back to the thin and stubborn sleep. You may dream of fur at night, but you will dream of endurance. And what you need tonight is endurance. The fire outside has gone out again. When you wake up, only faint embers remain, but something else caught your eye. A strange jar was squatting at the entrance of the tent. Clay vessels that have been blackened due to repeated use. A faint warm current seeped out from both sides of it. Someone moved the coal into the house and put it in a small fire basin to prevent the cold. A reliable historical fact is that soldiers sometimes used makeshift stoves, earthenware jars or metal braziers filled with coal to heat their tents. Burnt pottery and metal fragments have been discovered in camp layers during archaeological excavations in Europe and the Near East. Evidence of these temporary heaters. Chroniclers also mention them, describing the fire jars carried into shelters and smoldering around the weary. They are dangerous, but they offer something that even cloaks or animal skins cannot provide. A warm night. Here is a strange gossip. Sometimes soldiers would throw herbs or pine needles into the ashes, not only to give off a faint fragrance, but also to prevent mosquito bites. Imagine lying half-scald, inhaling the small ched rosemary while still catching lice. How ironic that would be. The smell strangely mingled with smoke and sweat, creating an atmosphere that lay somewhere between a battlefield and a kitchen. Some people even swear that certain herbs can ward off evil spirits, so a glowing pot serves a double purpose: heaters and supernatural shields. But historians are still debating whether these braziers were ordinary or rare luxuries. Some people claim that only officers can afford such devices, while ordinary people rely entirely on their body temperature. Others, however, point out that even humble camps produced countless pieces of pottery, which indicates that they were a widespread form of improvisation. Were these stoves the privilege of the nobility, or were they invented by desperate people with a little clay and fire? This debate shone intermittently like embers. Step by step, you approach the pot and stretch out your hand to feel its gentle warmth. The weather wasn't hot, but in the well-ventilated tent, it felt quite magical. You can almost imagine sleeping soundly instead of gritting your teeth. Your palms went numb, your face softened, and for a moment, the chill around you receded. The others woke up, their eyes shining in a faint light. A person complained that cigarettes stung his throat. Another person coughed very hard, but no one drove him away. Whether there is a risk of suffocation or not, no one is willing to give up that precious heat. As the coal lumps sank, the pot made a soft humming sound and wisps of smoke rose along the canvas roof. The air is getting thicker and more hazy. He coughed gently, then pulled your clench tighter, trying to cover your nose, but you still drew closer, drawn by the warmth. Even if your eyes hurt, comfort always comes at a price. Now imagine a tent, with capes draped over their shoulders, the men squatted beside a small brazier, just like monks surrounding a sacred object. The coal lumps turned red, the face shone from below, and the shadow distorted on the rough canvas. It is both sacred and dangerous. Born in embers, die in smoke. Do you want to know if you get a headache and your throat growls from inhaling smoke? But you also know that you will wake up alive, and that's more important than anything else. When you lay down again, your cloak wrapped tightly, you felt the warmth radiating within the tent, though uneven. It was real. This is not enough to drive away the cold, but it can blunt its teeth. That basin of coal was placed steadily at the entrance. The guardian and threat merge into one. For your eyelids droop again, you realize this is the paradox of survival in the Middle Ages. Every kind of comfort, fire, drink, fur, even coal, has its shadow. Safety has never been free. You woke up again, your whole body stiff. This time you notice that your body is heavier than the previous night. That's not just the cold that's pressing on you. This is the weight of the clothes you've never taken off. Your cotton padded raincoat, that padded armor you wore under the steel, lay beside you like a discarded mattress. You realize that you have always regarded it as a temporary buffer pad to reduce the hardness of the permafrost. A straightforward historical fact is that soldiers often use their armor pads as bedding. The G. Anderson is more than just a battlefield umbrella. It was a thick cotton padded jacket, stuffed with layers of linen or wool, sometimes weighing up to 20 layers. When peeled off from the body at night, it can also serve as a mattress or a blanket. Some chronicles even describe that knights brought their helmets under their heads, just like pillows, turning war tools into fragile comforts. There is a strange gossip. The soldiers sometimes joked that G. Anderson was warmer when he was dead than when he was alive. What they mean is that lying on it is more comfortable than parading in it. During its movement, it will absorb sweat and heat until it feels like a furnace. But if it is laid flat on the ground, it almost becomes a luxurious filler. Some people swear that they sleep better with G. Anderson beer on their backs than on feather mattresses at home. But whether this is true or out of desperation, who can tell? However, historians are still debating just how practical this approach was. Some people believe that the Gambian by sun provides genuine insulating material, thick enough to protect people from frost and moisture. Others countered that once sweat seeped through and stiffness occurred, they are merely barriers blocking the mud. Was G. Anderson the savior of the night, or just another wet cloth dragged from the battlefield to the camp? These materials have left us a mystery. Now lie down and feel the uneven quilting beneath your spine. Some spots are raised and some are sunken, but compared with the bare ground, it is paradise. The damp cold is still seeping upwards, but at least your bones won't be crushed on the permafrost. You tightly wrap the cloak around your shoulders, breathing in the stench of sweat stuck to the fabric. It smells sour, musky, and definitely human. This G. Anderson has endured several days of labor, fighting, and fear. This is a kind of patience. Around you, others do the same. A man was lying down, his G. Anderson raincoat half draped over him, like a blanket. The other one lay directly on his breastplate, as if it were a bedside table. A young soldier held his helmet against his chest, curled up, as if holding a hardened cold child. Whenever someone moves, you can hear a faint sound of metal rubbing against each other, and the armor jingles like a rust band. The tent was filled with a mixed smell of wool, sweat, and iron. This is not pleasant, but it is familiar. Your nose adjusted a little, and soon the smell became the background, almost reassuring. You close your eyes and imagine that the layers of colt beneath you are feathers rather than rags. The fabric scratches your skin through your coat, but you tell yourself it's soft, because only in this way can you rest. Depict the scene clearly. G. Anderson spread out like pieces of mattresses pieced together, their seams torn apart in the battle, and their fillings protruded like a tuft of hair. The cloak was thrown on it, forming an uneven pile of bedding. The helmet shone slightly in the dim light. Some were pressed into pillows, while others were neatly piled up in the corner. The entire tent looks like a pile of war equipment, but has been transformed into furniture. When you let your body sink into this strange mattress, you realize how ironic it is. All the swords, armors and helmets designed for damage turned into survival tools at night. War makes even fillers sacred, for it is the only barrier between you and the frozen booth. You close your eyes, cross your hands over your chest, and slowly enter a shallow and restless state of rest, grateful for that softness that is not soft at all. You suddenly woke up and wrinkled your nose before you even opened your eyes. This time it wasn't because of the cold, but because of the smell. A tent was crowded with people and had never smelled anything, but after a night of smoke, sweat and damp wool, the smell turned into its own life. You inhale carefully, and it sticks to your lungs. Half minus burned wood gave off pungent smoke. Sour sweat deeply soaked the cape. Damp wool gave off the smell of a dog, and beneath all this, there was a faint yet undeniable smell of something burning, as if a stew-pot had boiled and scorched the bottom. A definite historical fact is that the camps in the Middle Ages, the four chroniclers described the bravery of knights, or the pain of marching. They often mentioned stench. The fire kept burning, soaking the canvas and clothes in the pungent smoke. The tent was trapped by moisture, and the wool and linen turned into moldy sponges. Coupled with the fact that soldiers seldom take baths on the battlefield, you begin to understand why the smell of the military camp is a phrase that needs no explanation. Here is a strange gossip. Some commanders ordered that herbs be scattered on the tent floor to mask the smell. Soldiers crushed lavender, rosemary or thyme under their boots, pretending that they could freshen the air. Imagine lying on a straw smeared with thyme, and the smell suddenly vanishes under the strong smell of sweat. In some areas, men wear a small bag of dried herbs around their necks, not out of elegance, but to breathe in anything other than smoke at all costs. However, historians are still puzzled about just how significant the stench was. Some people think that this happened so frequently that the soldiers didn't notice that their noses had been numbed by weeks of filth. Others, however, believe that it has real consequences, spreading diseases by attracting flies and polluting the air. Is this just unpleasant, or is there another invisible enemy that is exhausting? The evidence does not provide us with definite evidence. Only sporadic descriptions say that the soldiers vomited on their cloaks. You moved your body uncomfortably, pulling the fabric closer to your face, and the smell became stronger. The walls, soaked with sweat and smoke, roughly clung to your cheek. You cough gently, and your throat roars because of the polluted air you have breathed all night. Around you, others wake up groaning, their voices coarse and hoarse. The person sneezed loudly and shook the curtain of the tent. Another person cursed at the stench, even though he knew nothing could be changed. These scents interwove together like layers of pain. The smoke shrouds your tongue, a metallic bitterness. Sweat will stick the sour and oily smell to your nostrils. Wet wool smells almost like an animal. I'd like to remind you that your cloak used to cover you when you were walking on full legs. Somewhere nearby, the leather boots gave off their own smell, half scorched by fire and half rotten due to dampness. Above all this, there is the faint burnt smell of the stew from last night, and the beans stubbornly stuck to the bottom of the pot. You rolled over, trying to bury your nose in the clean pleat of your cloak, but you couldn't escape. The air is thick and heavy, pressing on your senses. Even your dreams smell like smoke. You thought of home, of the fresh rush grass spread on the floor, of the clean bed sheets washed in the river. The sting of memory is stronger than the stench itself. Imagine the details of the tent, with the cape hanging on a wooden stake, covered in dirt, the helmet brimming with coal ash, and the faint smell of game rising from the fire, giving off a scent permeated with wool. The men kept moving, scratching, coughing and exhaling a sour smell mixed with everything else. The canvas walls themselves had absorbed the smoke for several months, until they gave off their own bitter taste in the warmth of the fire. However, strangely enough, smell has also become a part of the survival rhythm. It tells you that you are still alive, that the people around you are still breathing, still sweating, and still sharing this tragic refuge. The rampant weather is indeed unpleasant, but quiet and clean air means something even worse, an empty tent. You took another breath and coughed, allowing that foul smell to settle in your chest, like another layer of armor. When you close your eyes again, you will realize that the medieval camps are about both lasting enemies and lasting feelings. Cold, smoke, dampness, itching and odors minus, all of these are eternal companions. All of these remind us how to measure survival, not in comfort but in persistence. And tonight, persistence is the only fragrance you can wipe. When you first heard it, you were half asleep and half awake. A gentle tapping sound, just like fingers tapping on a canvas, and a distinct chill seeped in through the cracks. Rain, or even worse, snow, found that every crevice was dripping onto the already tired face from the cold. The tent, which sometimes felt like a vulnerable refuge, has now become one's own enemy, gathering storms inside. You rolled over and felt the raindrops splashing on your cheeks, cold enough to shake you straight. From the existing records, we know that the tents of the Middle Ages were notorious for leaking water. The thick canvas and linen provide shade and moderate protection, but once soaked by rain or snow, the fibers will sag and shed tears. Chronicles record that the soldiers woke up in a puddle, their cloaks soaked through, and their straw bedding was destroyed overnight. During a battle in Flanders, after a storm, the entire group abandoned their shelters, preferring to warm themselves by open-air stoves rather than suffer on wet walls. There is another strange custom worth mentioning. Some soldiers tried to waterproof the tents with a mixture of animal fat or tar. The result is not perfect. Water was still seeping in, but it made the canvas feel greasy and gave off a faint stench of lard. You can imagine that you hide inside and are greeted by smooth, sticky fabric that soaks your hands and clothes. This might offer some shelter from the rain, but it also means sleeping in a shelter that smells like a butcher's shop. There are various explanations for how soldiers truly endure long periods of torrential rain. Some historians believe that they kept rotating, sending people to cut new straw to replace the straw that had turned into a paste. Others, however, believe that such pain can only be tolerated. The men slept wet, shivering when they woke up, and continued marching in their soaked equipment. Is there an effective system to stay dry, or is survival merely a matter of tenacious endurance? These sources provided contradictory clues, but did not give clear answers. You wrapped your cloak tighter, but the moisture still slipped in. Wool is warm and even damp, but when it sticks to your skin, it gives a wet feeling. The ground beneath your feet has turned into soft mud, with water seeping upwards, as if the earth is devouring you. Around you, men are cursing, changing their bedding and blocking the holes with their cloaks. A man moaned. Raindrops kept falling on his forehead. No matter how he turned around, he refused to move. The smell in the tent grew stronger. The wet wool carried a sour smell from the farmyard. Leather will become sharp and pungent after soaking. The smoke rising from the fire outside mixes with the damp air, creating a heavy smell that presses on your lungs. When you cough, the people beside you cough too. Every breath blew out a pale mist in the darkness. Imagine this scene. The canvas walls hung down, washed by the water flow. The straw and ATS sank into the mire, and the cloaks wrapped around the trembling corpses like shells. Outside, the fire hissed, and raindrops sprayed on the embers, giving off small clumps of steam. Night is alive. It is not the sound of the present, but a constant dripping, 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 an uneasy rhythm that seeps into every dream. However, there is some strange unity in the midst of pain. Not long ago, people were still complaining about each other, but now they are mocking their common fate. A soldier joked that mourning would make him grow cheeks. Another person swore that the water that had dropped on him was sacred. Silence in baptism. Laughter resounded through the tent, faint yet sincere. At that moment, humor became its own blanket, covering the damp body with a fragile warmth. You pull your cloak tighter and close your eyes again, knowing that the storm won't end just because you want to. Raindrops will fall, boots will be soaked through, bedding will stink, and in the morning, armor will be heavier than before. But somehow, you also know that no matter what, you will stand up, stiffened in pain, ready to move forward in the mud. The tent may leak water and the ground may suck your feet, but routine will keep you going, and this can prevent you from freezing to death and make you refuse to stop more than rhinus or wolf. The storm has passed, but the night is never safe. You lay there, listening to the rain gradually fall silent, just waiting for another sound to replace it, a faint jingling sound like the collision of charms. When you raise your head, you will notice strange shapes hanging from the tent poles. Small bags, wooden crosses, bones tied with ropes. They are not decorations. They are another form of defense, not woven from wool or wood, but from faith. Contemporary works remind us that superstition permeated every level of medieval soldiers, including sleep. People pinned amulets in their cloaks, hung them on the ropes of their tents, and carved symbols on wooden poles, hoping to keep evil out of the harbor when they lay vulnerable in the dark. Some people wore tentsinmedievalwarfare, while others grabbed relics smaller than fragments, claiming that they were fragments of a sacred temple. The boundary between faith and survival has become blurred in every small refuge. There are also some even stranger habits. Soldiers in Eastern Europe sometimes tied the skulls of small animals to tents, believing that this could ward off frost demons or wandering souls. Others sprinkled holy water or something else on the edge of the tent, just like an invisible fence. You can imagine a tired man fumbling around his bottle, shaking a few drops on the muddy ground and muttering prayers. It is more about comfort than certainty. The focus of academic debate is how much of it is genuine religious practice and how much is merely folk superstition. Some experts insist that these charms reflect sincere education and are an extension of the faith that drove people to join the Crusades or make pilgrimages. Others, however, believe that this is more out of instinct rather than dogma. The original posture of fighting against fear is no different from knocking on a piece of wood. Are the soldiers protecting their souls, or just trying to distract themselves? The record gave us some fragments, but no clear conclusion was reached. You reach out your hand and touch the charm closest to you. It was a piece of cloth tied up in a knot, smeared with grease and giving off a faint smell of smoke. Perhaps it once held herbs, or perhaps it was a token of a wife or child, but now it has become a talisman in this damp camp. The person who hung it thought it was very important. When you lie beneath it, you will realize that it is also very important to you, because it reminds you of the world beyond war. Around you, people are whispering, praying and cursing, half asleep and half awake. A soldier kept making the sign of the cross on his chest and muttering the name of the sage. Another person stroked a wooden token, habitually rubbing its smooth with his thumb. Some others snore loudly without realizing it. Either they are too tired, or they are too disloyal and don't want to join in. The tent turned into a strange little church. Its congregation spread out its limbs on the damp ground. Its hymns murmured to itself, and its sacred objects were pieced together temporarily. The air was not only filled with the stench of wet wool, but also the faint sweetness of crushed herbs, perhaps lavender or thyme. You inhale. For a moment, the tent smells just like a fireplace at home. Then another draft was passed and the illusion vanished. You still hold on to it tightly. Imagine that the canvas is slightly illuminated by coal. The shadow of the talisman is swaying. The pendant is rubbing against the fabric. The cross is shining in the dim light. The soldiers' faces are glinting with sweat and soot, their eyes half-minus closed, but they are charging towards these amulets as if to check if they are still there. Outside, the wind is blowing the rope, but inside, you will feel the fragile comfort of faith strung together, like a thread among everyone. You closed your eyes again, and your hand was still brushing the small knots on the cloth. Perhaps it did nothing. Perhaps it has no power at all. That belief itself is power. On a cold night when everything else is hostile, even a little bit of superstition can make one feel like a shield. You take a deep breath, grasping that thought tightly as if wrapped in a blanket, and then drift again into an uneasy rest. What protects you is not the wall, nor the warmth, but your own or someone else's belief. It doesn't matter. When you wake up, you feel something warm pressing down beside you. This time it's not soldiers, but more gentle people. You gently turned around and found that the wild dog was tightly curled up beside you, its nose tucked into its tail, breathing calmly. It crawls in at night and chooses a corner of your tent as its refuge. At that moment, the coldness faded away, and all you could feel was the steady thermal pulses emitted by its tiny body. Chroniclers often noticed that animals roamed freely in medieval camps, with dogs being the most common companions. They picked up leftovers, guarded supplies and followed soldiers, as if bound by an invisible belt. When the night turned cold, these animals were not driven away. They are popular and share warmth with their human companions. Having a dog around is not just a comfort. It is a practical survival tool, a Firminus-legged heater for living people. This is a wonderful glimpse at the edge of history. Some soldiers give dogs honorary roles in military camp life, calling them mascots or guardians. A source from the Burgundy campaign told the story of a dog nicknamed Captain who slept in the commander's tent. When enemy scouts approached, it would bark loudly and wake them up. Another account holds that during the siege, the dogs were wrapped in spare cloaks, and their warmth was cherished just as much as their loyalty. However, experts still disagree on whether this connection is universal or specific. Some people think that dogs are everywhere and indispensable companions for lonely soldiers. Others, however, believe that their role has been exaggerated. Animals spreading fleas and stealing food are a nuisance rather than an aid. Is this doggle of comrade minus in minus arms or another hungry gnawed in the already stretched camp? The truth remains as unclear as ever. You stroke the animal's fur, rough and comfortable. Like everything else in the camp, it gave off a faint smell of smoke and meat scraps, but its warmth was undeniable. You can feel its steady heartbeat, faster than yours, as steady as a drum. The dog shrank deeply and moved closer, as if it knew about the deal. It provides heat, and in return, it is sheltered. Around you, other men will notice you. Someone complained jealously, muttering that you had stolen the best blanket in the camp. Another person chuckled softly and said that this dog was smarter than most soldiers because it could find warmer's place. The third person threw a small piece of bread to the other side of the tent. Without raising its head, the elephant picked up the bread. In that dim space, dogs were more than just animals. It becomes a bridge, uniting tired people in common entertainment. A smell in the tent slightly faded because of the dog's presence. Strangely enough, the musky scent of the fur blends with that of the wool, almost masking the smell of sweat and smoke. Inhaling for a moment, imagine a fireplace, a home in a village, a life that freely offers warmth, rather than being seized from the darkness. Imagine this scene, the dog curled up into a tight circle, the soldiers huddled under their cloaks with their eyes half-minus closed, all sharing the same fragile callus. The canvas wall swayed in the wind, but in the presence of the animals, this group of people were entered. This is a small reminder not everything is gloomy in war. Even on the coldest night, loyalty can huddle by your side and keep you alive. You close your eyes, place your hand on the dog's side abdomen, feel its chest rise and fall, and its warmth seeps into your bones, stable and quiet. Perhaps this is not a miracle, it's just that the body temperature is the same as any other body temperature. But in the cold election campaign, this feeling is quite magical. You make your breathing in sync with the rhythm of animal Z. Slowly, you entered a deeper sleep state than other times. It seems that tonight's survival comes with wagging tails and quiet sighs. Morning always seems not to come fast enough, but tonight you find yourself awake, not because of the cold or the itch, but from the silence. The dog has run away. The fire outside has been extinguished. Inside the tent, the usual murmurs and snores have vanished. Only silence was broken from time to time by the sound of the wind tearing at the canvas of the road. It took you a little time to understand why. The commanders have ordered silence. There is no singing, no idle chatting, no loud prayer, only silence, heady and composed. Documents of military regulations show that discipline often lasts until late at night. The soldiers were warned not to make noise, not only to maintain order, but also to prevent enemy scouts from discovering the camp. Silence is a tool for survival, as firm as any rations or training. A noisy camp may comfort its people, but it also reveals its position. A quiet tent means safer soldiers. Although the price is a suffocating silence that makes everyone feel heavy, however, there are also strange exceptions. Some armies invented the code for whispering signals, the clicking of tongues, and the slight tapping of shields, allowing people to communicate without raising their voices. Imagine being awake or lying down, not hearing a single word, only a faint tapping sound, indicating that everything is fine, or a hissing sound, indicating that there is trouble. These tiny sounds became the lullaby of discipline. Remind people that silence does not mean neglect but vigilance. People have different interpretations of the strictness of these rules. Some historians believe that commanders used cruel punishments to force silence, whipping those who laughed too loudly. Others, however, believe that outside the battle, near the enemy line, soldiers ignored orders, filling the tents with noise. Is this silence widespread or merely an ideal that scholars want their readers to believe in? Reality may change with each commander, and every night you lay there, listening in silence. No snoring, no coughing, no singing in a low voice. Tents without them feel very different, almost creepy. Your own heartbeat becomes louder in your ears. The dog moved slightly, rubbing its tail against the ground. Even so, in the silence, it felt like a shout. You turned around, trying not to let the cloak rustle, but the faint rubbing sound of the fabric seemed to be amplified, as sharp as a blade rubbing against a stone. The air becomes heavy because of the unspoken words. People breathe carefully and shallowly, as if even the act of living might violate the rules. You can imagine their eyes open in the dark. Everyone knows the others, and no one dares to speak. This is a special kind of intimate relationship. There is no small talk left, only the simple fact of breathing together. The smell fills the void left by the silence of sound. The smoke lingered like a blanket. The moisture in the wall gives a sharpened, earthy feeling. The leather gives off a sour smell. In the absence of sound, your senses are more sensitive to these odors. It seems that the tent itself wants to remind you that silence cannot eliminate discomfort. Imagine the camp from above. Piles of pitch-black tents were huddled together. There was no singing, no laughter. The only sounds were the wind blowing through the rope and the occasional sound of burning firewood. To outsiders, it seems more like a cemetery rather than a living camp. Each tent is a tombstone under the moonlight. However, there lies power in the quietness. You feel that discipline binds you together, invisible but very strong. In silence, people not only learn to endure the cold, but also the stillness. They lay in bed with no unspoken faults or fears in their hearts, only whispering prayers in their hearts. This is another kind of survival, not by warmth but by restraint. When you tuck into your cloak, silence strikes, but you calm it down, drooping eyelids, your body stiffened. You didn't fall into the noisy half-awake state like on other nights, but entered a deeper and more regular sleep. Silence holds you in place like an iron frame, unwaveringly, yet steadily leads you towards the dawn. When dawn slowly streaks across the horizon, it brings little warmth. The fire outside has turned to ashes. The dog slipped out to pick up the leftovers. You noticed something different in the tent. Two people were covered with a blanket of an unmatched color. At first you thought it was their own, but no, it's more finely woven. Its dye is darker and the fabric is softer than anything used by ordinary soldiers. Then you realize what it is. Spoils. Someone snatched it. Perhaps it came from a village yesterday. Perhaps it's a noble luggage cart. The chronicles of the campaign repeatedly mention the way soldiers picked up bedding and blankets from the conquered towns. The pillows, quilts and carpets taken out from home were eventually stuffed into the muddy tents and covered over the exhausted bodies, yet these people simply didn't care about their origins. One account of Basil is that the knights dragged silk sheets into their tents, while the infantry stuffed wool mattresses torn from farmers' beds into their tents. War turns the comfort of the family into equipment for survival, and sometimes the outcome is almost laughable. The men slept under the embroidered curtains on the church altar, or wrapped themselves in curtains hastily cut from the noble hall. Imagine being curled up in the cloth that was once used for praying for mass, but now giving off the smell of smoke in a soldier's tent, or a farmer's tattered cotton quilt, hastily stuffed with extra straw, regarded as a luxury because it could shield from the wind. Modern historians are divided on just how widespread this practice is. Some people think this is very common because the military relies heavily on plundered supplies. When the food was taken away, the linen was also taken away. Others warn that the chroniclers have exaggerated the facts, focusing their attention on the splendid stories of the nobles and silk, while most of the soldiers still wear plain cloaks. Is having bedding snatched a common occurrence or a rare stroke of luck? The truth remains uncertain, just like the fabric itself, woven from pieces of evidence. You changed your position and touched the edge of the blanket close to you with your hand. It is smoother than your own cloak, with tight silk threads. Even in dim light, the dye remains clearly visible. The men shed their sighs with relief in their sleep. Their bodies curled up under the stolen warmth. Their faces looked younger and softer, as if they had comfortably stripped away years of pain. The people around the tent also noticed. Eamon looked at the blanket, jealously unpulled his tattered cloak tighter. Another person spat softly, muttering that the spoils would never fall into the hands of the poor. However, no one took action to take it away. In such cold, tearing off warmth is almost a crime against survival itself. The blanket remained, but its origin was forgotten. Now its purpose is only one thing: to keep the soldiers alive. The smell around the looted fabric is different. Unlike the woolen products of smoke and sweat, it has a faint sweet taste, perhaps lavender or rose water, once soaked in some forgotten ring. Now the smell is very faint and almost unattached, but it is enough to remind you that this blanket once belonged to a soft world. In sharp contrast, the fine fabric was kneaded into a paste, and the fine silk thread served as a shield against the cold. Imagine the tent as the first filter in the survival patchwork. Some were wrapped in stolen velvet, some in rough fur, and others were shivering only in cloaks. Helmets and wild antelopes were scattered on the ground and used as pillows and mattresses. The blanket covering the two people was like a gem fallen into the mud, reminding people of the strange role of the marauders in keeping the army moving forward. You close your eyes again and imagine how many soldiers there were before you slept under someone else's treasure. The curtains, carpets, and the cloths on the altar were all torn off and turned into bedding in the darkness. War not only takes away lives, it stole comfort and changed it. Tonight, you sleep among the fragments of someone else's home, clumsily sewing them together in your own fragile existence. The stolen blanket couldn't reach you, so you went back to your straw corner. When you move, it makes a faint crackling sound and the dry stem breaks under your weight. This sound was strangely reassuring. At least this means that the straw has not yet got damp. You stroked it with your hand, feeling the rough end sting your skin, and realized that although it was itchy, it was still better than lying directly on the frozen ground. The records of medieval armies clearly show that straw was a standard bedding. They cut bundles from the nearby fields, dragged them into the tent and spread them under the cloak as the original insulating material. The chroniclers noted that during the long siege, the straw from the entire carriage was specially requisitioned for bedding. Without it, the earth absorbs heat too quickly. When people wake up, their whole bodies are stiff and trembling, and sometimes even their hair is frozen to the ground. However, there are also some creative twists. Some soldiers stuffed straw into sacks, sewed up the top and made rough mattresses. Some people also scatter rush grass or dry reeds on the ground, carefully layering them so that the pointed ends face down. Archaeological evidence even indicates that in some areas, people used ferns or pine needles instead of straw because they would release a pleasant smell when crushed. Imagine that your tent is filled with smoke and sweat, but every time you move, your bedding gives off a faint forest fragrance. Experts are still debating just how effective straw is. Some people believe that it is replaced frequently. It can provide good insulation and capture air between the straws. Others point out that once it gets damp, the straw becomes useless and will soon mold, attracting pests. Is straw true comfort, or a temporary illusion. The truth seems to depend entirely on the frequency with which soldiers are allowed to update, and in war, this is never enough. Stretch your legs and feel the uneven padding under your feet. Some stems will sting you, while others will cushion your joints. Its texture keeps changing and has never been truly soft, but it just happens to relieve the pain of the earth. Around you, men are moving on their own straw beds, each pile uneven, and some have only a few left after being trampled all night. Enan muttered to himself as he pulled out a stem from under his cloak, rubbed it with his fingers like an amulet, and then threw it aside. The smell of hay filled the tent, dry, dusty, and slightly sweet. It mingled with the pungent smell, and for a while the tent smelled almost like a barn. You took a deep breath, thinking of the stable, of the animals lying on the bed, warm and safe, and envious of them. Horses in deep straw stables can be more comfortable than those who intend to ride them. Imagine the tent carefully. The cape was spread out on the uneven haystack. The boots were lined up along the crack of the door. G. Emberson carelessly threw it at the top of the rush grass. The straw gave off a faint golden glow in the dim morning light. A rare light emerged in the darkness. The fragments stuck to the clothes, to the hair and beard, making the man look as if he had grown dried beard overnight. No one wants to brush it off anymore. It has become a part of camp life. Another layer of discomfort is so familiar that it no longer incurs complaints. You turn sideways and press your cheek against the fragile stem. They will scratch you, but they will also support you, keeping your face from touching the cold mud. You sighed, grateful for this thin barrier. By any standard, straws are not luxurious, but they are sufficient. In the world of tents and cold nights, enough is the closest thing you can find to comfort. The morning came with a shrill sound. He brought not warmth but a deeper chill, as if it had already seeped into your bones while you were sleeping. You open your eyes and see your breath gathering dark clouds before you, just like the smoke rising from a fire about to go out. The walls of the tent were frozen very hard. The canvas crackled when touched, and each seam had a white crystal outline. You changed your cloak and found that the part of it that had absorbed the moisture from last night was also frozen, stiff like a plank, and unwillingly bent as you moved. News from the winter campaign tells us that for medieval soldiers, cold mornings were one of the worst weather conditions. Hanukkahs described tents wrapped in rinds, ropes that were pulled would break, and armor that had to be pried open before being put on. Even the horses stood there, covered in frost, their breaths rising like steam in the pale dawn. To get through such a morning, what is needed is not the strength of one's arms, but pure perseverance, the ability to force a frozen body to move. There are even stranger sayings, if not so tragic, almost humorous. Sometimes men wake up to find their beards frozen and their cloaks by ice crystals. Others found that the boots were so hard that they could stand upright without feet, and overnight they turned into strangely shaped statues. Imagine you stumble out of the tent, shaking your boots that looked like a piece of wood, cursing and trying to soften the leather by the fire. Scholars hold different opinions on the extent to which these icy and snowy conditions have weakened the military. Some people believe that the entire campaign has come to a standstill because the frost has made the armor unusable and the roads impassable. Others, however, believe that the soldiers are merely enduring. Their movements are slow but still ruthless. Is a cold morning disastrous, or just another kind of pain for many people? The evidence is too inconsistent to completely solve this problem. He slowly sat up and pulled the cloak off your shoulders, making a crackling sound. Your fingers hurt, are stiff and clumsy, and you feel as if your coat is frozen. Around you, the sounds of wailing and cursing shake the tabernacle. A person shook his straw bedding, sending out a faint frosty rain. Another person was frantically rubbing his hands, blowing air at them on murmuring prayers through his trembling teeth. In this light, everyone looked a little older. Their faces were pale and sunken, and their eyes were squinted, facing the pale sun without a hint of warmth. The smell of the camp wafted through the frost. The pungent smoke hung in the air, fresher than before, as if even the fire was struggling to burn in the air. The usual body odor has vanished, replaced by a bone-minus chilling cold, although beneath it still lingers a faint sour smell of damp wool frozen into ice. You took a deep breath A sharp pain pierced your lungs and began to cough into the cold air. You imagine yourself crawling towards the crack of the tent door. The ground outside was glittering with silver light, and every blade of grass was covered with frost. The armor was scattered on the ground, and there was a thin layer of ice on the helmet and breastplate. It's so cold that it reflects the morning light. The horse stumped its feet, snorted, and steam was rising from its nostrils. Fire struggled. People crouched down and, with trembling hands, coaxed the embers back to life. It doesn't look like an army, but more like a group of slowly stinging statues. You force yourself to stand up, with every joint stiffened, every movement reluctant. Your boots are very hard and the leather will crack slightly when you walked. He lifted the handles off the ground and almost dropped it. I was shocked by the pain of being bitten on the skin by it. In this state, metal feels more like a weapon than armor and even harms the wearer before the enemy arrives. You blow on it, rub your cloak against it, and do everything possible to soften the bone-chilling cold around you. Others were also engaged in the same small minor-scale battle. They heated their swords by the fire, tightened the stiff straps and shook off the frost on their cloaks. No one talked much. Cold steals language just as it steals heat. The only sounds were the cracking of ice, the hissing of breathing, and the dull groans of people straightening themselves. However, even in such pain, life goes on. Someone made a joke about the resurrection of the statue, and a faint laugh spread throughout the entire camp. Another soldier was in despair. He brought his frozen boots to clench to the flames, which bellowed fiercely, drawing curses and ridicule. These absurd moments broke the silence. It proves that even if a man's teeth are trembling, he can still smile. You pulled your cloak tighter and gazed at the pale sun, which reluctantly climbed up into the sky. It offers light but no warmth, depicting frost as a glittering pattern. If beauty can coexist with numb fingers and aching lungs, then it almost looks beautiful. You sighed, your shoulders heavy, getting ready to embrace a new day. A cold morning may stiffen the armor and crack the cloak, but it cannot stop the march. This realization, though painful, is your only warmth before night falls. The cold dawn had just begun when the order came. March. You moaned along with the others, straightened your stiff body, wrapped your cloak tightly, and then walked out into the fragile air. Every movement feels like it belongs to someone else, as if your joints were rusty and cleansed hinges. The ground beneath my feet creaked and was covered with a layer of frost. Every step you take reminds you that if there is truly warmth, it will still take several hours. Historians have repeatedly pointed out that medieval armies rarely enjoyed the luxury of long periods of rest in camps. After a cold night, the soldiers were expected to march forward with their chests held high, their armors clanging, their tents crowded, and their carriages creaking. Some people's legs could hardly bend and they staggered along like old men under the commander's roar. Endurance is not merely about getting through a night. It's about getting up and moving again at dawn. No matter how broken the body feels, there is an even stranger side. It was reported that men deliberately wiped snow on their faces in the morning to wake themselves up. This logic is cruel, but very effective. The ice pricks your eyes and cheeks, forcing blood to flow and making your body sway. And imagine you stumble out of the tent, half exhausted, and grab a snow fan in your face. This sounds like torture, but it's still better than falling down before the parade starts. Experts hold different opinions on how soldiers can truly manage these daily oral medications. Some people believe that, whether people like it or not, the cries of war orders, the beating of war drums, and the formation of columns, all these rhythms are driving people to act. Some people also said that the soldiers often fell behind, staggering on the road, and the commander kept scolding them to keep up. Is the discipline in the morning really unbreakable? Or is it more chaotic than what the chronicles say? The fact might be that both are present. The theory is rigid and the practice is rough. You shouldered the bundle, pressing heavily on your cloak and raincoat, and joined the footsteps leaving the camp. Let the fire simmer. The dog is running wildly beside the pillar, and the tent collapses behind you. Frost crackles in the canvas folds. The air he smells even worse, filled with cold earth and smoke stuck to your hair. Hundreds and thousands of people exhaled simultaneously, giving off steam like a mist along the marching line. Your feet hurt with every step you take. These boots were still wet and rubbing against the skin, Every soldier you pass by is a little weak and powerless. Their bodies worse if and half minus frozen from sleep. However, the sound of movement is taking shape. Hundreds and thousands of boots creaked, armors groaned, and people muttered. It turns into a rhythm, dragging you forward. Every step brings you further away from rest, but also closer to what awaits you. Marching feels like it never ends. You look forward but see nothing except your cape curled up and your spear swaying like withered grass. Behind you, the same scene stretches all the way to the horizon. Occasionally, a horse hums its nose and its hooves step on the frosty hard ground, reminding you that even animals suffer. Your stomach was roaring. Your throat was scorched by the dry air, but you still left. This is the absurdity. Nowadays, men also joke around. A soldier shouted. His legs had turned into frozen wood. Another reply said, but at least wood burns warmer. Laughter trickled down, faint but real. Some people began to hum off minor ski tune at a dragging rhythm, but others hummed along too. The sounds interwove with the creaking of the boots. This song is not happy, but it brings you. The scenery fades away slowly. Every mile is dotted with frostbitten trees, grey skies and pale lands. Your cloak is shaking very badly. The edge solidifies in the jagged waves. You glanced at your companions and saw that their faces were pale, their lips were chapped, and their eyes were red from the cold wind, but their chins were tight. Marching is painful, but it is also an action, and action means survival. When the sun rose, you had been walking for several hours, feeling weak and wet all over. Your body no longer fully feels its numb feet, painful shoulders and bent back. But strangely enough, numbness has become its own armor. The pain becomes dull, replaced by rhythm. Left foot, right foot. Inhale, exhale. The world shrinks to this cycle, repeating over and over again, until it almost turns into meditation. As you walk on, you will realize that this is the secret to survival in the medieval battles. Not only do one have to endure the cold nights, but also the frozen mornings. When your instincts require you to lie down and never stand up again, you stand up, you go. You let the rhythm carry you forward, even if your heart is cold. By noon, the march should lead you into a different landscape, although the cold still stubbornly haunted you. However, you have noticed that not every army is facing the same pain. Soldiers from different corners of Europe brought their own traditional fabrics and winter equipment. Everyone is suitable for or sometimes not very suitable for the climate they are most familiar with. That night, lying in the tent again, you would think, depending on where you came from, how different survival seemed. The existing records show obvious regional differences. In Northern Europe, wool dominates everything. The thick cloak, the layer upon layer of hoods, and even the finger gloves were sewn with felt shavings. The chroniclers of Flanders described that people were wrapped in thick woolen snow slid down their shoulders like water. Meanwhile, soldiers from the south often struggled when forced into the winter of the north. Their lighter linen clothes are perfect for the Mediterranean breeze, but they become a burden in sleet and icy snow. Some people, even frozen, were not used to the night when the ground turned to stone. There are also some special impromptu performances. People from cold regions sometimes stuff their boots with moss or wool, a trick passed down from shepherds. In contrast, the Italians were renowned in the battles of the Alps for wearing layer upon layer of spare shirts under their armor. This was not about keeping warm without a cloak, but rather using a variety of thin fabrics for warmth. Imagine peeling off 5 linen shirts at dawn, each covered with frost and still stuck to it, because even frozen linen is better than nothing. Nowadays, experts are divided on whether these regional practices are truly important in this field. Some people believe that the cultural dress tradition gives soldiers a real advantage in foreign climates. For instance, Scots and Norwegians were more likely to endure damp winters than soldiers from warm coasts. Others, however, believe that once men run for election, everyone's pain is the same. Wet wool is wet wool, no matter which corner of Europe you come from. Did the fabric tradition really affect survival, or was it quickly wiped away by mud and frost? The dispute remains unresolved. You lay on your back, thinking of your cloak, thick and itchy, getting off a smoky smell. You can imagine men in other places wearing cloaks dyed bright red or green or studded with fur. Some are family heirlooms, and those who wear them believe that these fabrics carry the power of their ancestors. The others were stolen from the village. The moment they were wrapped in the trembling corpses, their origin vanished. In war, the identity of the fabric is not important. What matters is whether it can block the wind. The tent was filled with all kinds of people, even among your own comrades. A soldier beside you was wearing a patched leather cloak with hardened shiny seams. Another blanket that was tightly grasping a conical stripe was clearly woven in another place. A third person wrapped himself up very thickly, looking like a pile of cloth, with no one inside. The diversity of fabrics creates a patchwork space in the din shelter. Each square tells a different story about where these people came from and what they brought into this frozen battle. The smell will also change along with the variation of the fabric. Wet wool smells heavy and sour. Linen is sharp and has a grassy smell. Musk and animal fur. Together they create a strange regional atmosphere, much like a redrawn map of Europe, with scents rather than boundaries. You breathe in the air and feel that you are not just surrounded by soldiers, but by the entire continent crammed into a tent. Look at this camp from above. Tents were scattered on the frost, and each tent was filled with people wrapped in their own traditional fabrics. On one side, the soldiers were curled up under the bright Flemish wool. Go to another place. The men from Spain draped the lighter cloaks tightly over their shoulders. Some people wear nothing but patched outerwear, while others hide under furs as soft as velvet. The battlefield erased nationality, but on the bone-chilling night, every stitch of the fabric reminds you of where you were born. You close your eyes, pull your cloak tighter, and realize that tonight's survival is not merely woven from wool and straw, but from culture itself. The choices of weavers and tailors, as well as the traditions that existed long before you, make you feel both warm and cold. For like tomorrow you will once again fight side with people far away. Tonight you will share their struggles and be wrapped together in a patchwork called made of European fabrics. As soon as the frost leaves the ground, you realize that the next harsh test is worse than an oaken march, siege, or camp outside the city walls. It's not a temporary halt, not a brief pain of 1 or 2 nights. They had to wait for weeks, or even months in damp trenches and wet tents, with the cold weather getting more and more intense day by day. Here, the tent is more of a cage than a shelter, trapping soldiers in smoke, damp soil and endless boredom. The chronicles of the Middle Ages tell us that the siege would last until the severe winter, and people had to sleep in the ground that had been stirred into mud. The soldiers dug shallow trenches, set up tents on the makeshift platform and prayed that their shelters could withstand the storm. According to the records of the siege of Torre in 1340, entire rows of tents collapsed in the heavy smoke. People dragged themselves out, half dead from the cold, and could only crawl back under the loose canvas. Unlike military campaigns, in action, there is no escape. One can only wait for hunger and weather in the endless night to defeat the enemy first. Some of the countermeasures are almost absurd. In some siege battles, soldiers built raised wooden pallets in their tents and covered them with cloaks and animal skins, just like rough bunk beds, allowing anything to remain above the flooded ground. Others spread the straw very thickly, piling it up to knee height. After a few days of rain, the straw would rot into a swamp. Imagine stinking, damp straw, mold and sweat fermenting together until the air itself seems toxic. Researchers are divided on the sustainability of life in besieged cities. Some people think that men have surprisingly good endurance, supported by supply rains and public fires. Others, however, insist that the consumption caused by cold, disease and filth is the true weapon of the siege, killing more soldiers than arrows. In this situation, is the tent a true refuge or merely a symbol of routine operation in an environment that has already fallen into hardship? The evidence points into directions, depending on who survived and told the story. You imagine yourself curled up in such a tent, listening to the rainbow minus like canvas night after night. The rope is knotted and the pole is bent. No matter how you mend it, water seeps in. Your coat was wet and stuck to your shoulders, and the straw beneath you had turned into black sludge. You tossed and turned in your sleep, with every movement creaking. This is not only uncomfortable, but also suffocating, as if the earth itself is devouring you. The smell grew stronger and stronger, until it was unbearable. Under the tent curtain was a pungent smoke, the rotten straw was moldy, and the damp wool was soaked with sweat, coupled with the unwashed corpses crammed into the cramped space. You will understand why men fall ill so quickly. The coughing echoed in the night, and the chest sounded like the drumbeat of illness. The tent originally used to protect lives turned into a room where the high fever spread faster than the fire. Imagine the camp outside. Rows of tents hung down under the frost. A ditch filled with slightly salty water. A soldier stumbled and threw water out with buckets, only to see more water seeping in. The flames stubbornly smoked and refused to burn properly in the damp wood. The horses stood in a bowl, exposing their ribs, and the air they exhaled was steaming in the grey air. The defenders watched from the city wall, knowing that time and weather had become allies. However, even here, people will improvise. Some people carved talismans on the pillars of the tent, believing that the symbols of the saints will keep the canvas upright. Others gathered in larger tents, gathering warmth and laughter, telling stories to mask the dripping sound. You will hear one person bragging that thanks to a fruit cloak snatched from a merchant, he had slept very dry for 3 consecutive nights, while another would bitterly joke that he was willing to trade his sword for an on-minus rotting straw mattress. When you close your eyes again and listen to the wind howling in the trenches, you realize that siege life is both a battle against the enemy and a battle against nature. Every night is a tenacious resistance, lying in the leaking tent, breathing in the stench of decay, and waking up to endure a new day. Survival is not measured by victory, but by the pure will to persist in living through a long and cold period of time. In the winter of the north, it's one thing that the cold torments you, but there's another kind of cold that catches you off guard, and that's the desert night. You might imagine sand and heat, the blinding sun baking this day painfully. And when night falls, the warmth vanishes, as if stolen by an invisible hand. A chill swept through the entire camp, in sharp contrast to the sweltering heat just a few hours ago. Those who had been marching all day long and sweating profusely now found themselves shivering under the starry sky. The records from the Levant Crusaders and the chronicles of the Moors' battles in Spain both describe how the soldiers struggled against the harsh fluctuations in temperature. The cloak soaked with sweat during the day hardens like a wooden board at night, trapping moisture in the skin. The fire became hard to sustain as the dry desert wind devoured the sparks, and the wood had to be cleared or traded at a high price. Once the moon rises, this scorching sun-minus exposed land becomes dangerous, and there are some special impromptu performances worth remembering. Soldiers often dug shallow pits in the sand, lay in them and covered themselves with their cloaks, so the soil itself served as an insulator. Others slept under their shields, using carved metal or wood to make roofs to fend off the cold wind. Some people even claim that burying their feet in the worms and before nightfall can allow them to get through the dawn comfortably. This trick is only effective when the desert can maintain the heat of the day for a long time. Scholars still have differences of opinion on whether these methods are really helpful. Some people point out that the records of people freezing to death in desert battles prove the insufficiency of improvisation. Others, however, believe that under such climatic conditions, the survival of the military proves that these tactics are at least effective to some extent. Are the soldiers enduring every night, or just taking a chance? The answer was unevenly buried underground, like a makeshift bed they had built. Imagine yourself lying in such a tent, with the canvas oared against the suddenly freezing hot wind. Sand creeps into every crack, fills your boots and grinds between your teeth. The stars in the sky seem endless, as sharp as frost, and their beauty mocks your trembling body. Your cloak is stuck by dry sweat, giving off a pungent and sour smell. The dry air makes it even stronger. Around you, people are coughing hoarsely, their throats growling with dust, and their voices as fragile as parchment. The silence of a desert night is different from the north wind. Here, there is no rustling of trees, no raindrops. Only the occasional barking of jackals and the chirping of night birds can be heard. It is a vast expanse of emptiness. Every sound was amplified, the footsteps treading on the sand, the hissing sound of the tent ropes moving, and the bang of the coal that refused to go out. You pulled your cape tighter, but the cold slipped through it like a snake, seeping into every crevice. Imagine the camp from above. The tents huddled together like black shells, scattered on the pale sand dunes. Everyone emitted a faint light from within, and people gathered around the wooden brazier they had picked up. The horse stood with a rope tied up, hunched over, breathing in the dry night air. The flames flickered faintly, and the firelight was swallowed up by the boundless desert. From a distance, this army looks like several fireflies trapped in an endless sea of sand. Despite this, laughter could still be heard from inside the tent. A soldier joked that he preferred the snow in his hometown to this cursed place that made you sweat and freeze on the same day. Another muttered, at least the lice here'd die faster in the dry air. A burst of laughter broke out in the tent. Survival is not only closely linked to cloaks and flames, but also to humor, which is the last line of defense against despair. Close your eyes. The sand is rubbing against your cheek. The stars are shining overhead. The cold still seeps into your bones. But you tell yourself dawn is approaching. The sun will rise. Heat will return again. This cycle of burning days and cold nights forms its own rhythm, as stable and painful as the frost in the north. In this rhythm, the soldiers endured. The night in the desert left its mark. However, the endless winter can also cause people pain, and eventually the body begins to show the cost of these exercises. One morning when you woke up, you found the cough you heard in the tent last week had not gone away. It has grown exponentially. People were chopping in the darkness, and we were chopping in the darkness. Their chests crackled, as if crushed stones had been poured in. You touch your throat, roaring in the smoke and frost, understanding that illness is like your cloak, always by your side. Surviving letters and chronicles reveal how illness was inseparable from the cold nights at the camp. Pneumonia, fever and frostbite spread faster than arrows. Even a slight chill can be fatal when people sleep in damp places night after night. A commander in the Baltic Sea lamented that more soldiers died from ice and snow and coughs than from enemy swords. This is a fact that every army knows but cannot escape. Cold makes the body weak, and weakness leads to illness. There are also some even stranger details. The things that the soldiers did to heal themselves. Some people drink warm beer with garlic added, claiming that it can drive away the cold. Some people wrapped hot stones in cloth and held them against their chests, hoping that the heat could drive away their coughs. Some people even put onion slices in their boots, believing that the smoke spreading upwards can clean their lungs. Imagine the stench in the tent, with smoke, sweat and onions all mixed together, suffocating. Modern researchers are divided on just how destructive the disease caused by the common cold is. Some people think that destroyed the army and caused most casualties in some winters. Others, however, believe that soldiers who have become strong in a life already full of exposure can tolerate diseases better than we think. Were concentration camps really the graves of coughs, or did people exaggerate their suffering in letters and chronicles? The argument continued, echoing like a cough. You lie down and listen to the symphony of diseases around you. There is a man on your left who is slashing grass vigorously and spitting chicken legs into the straw. Another man, grasping his chest and whispering that his ribs were like knives. Someone sneezed wet and smelly, and then immediately cursed. The sound was continuous, drowning out the crackling of the fire outside and the howling of the wind through the cracks. The smell has also changed. Smoke and wool still dominate, but beneath them are the soreness of disease, dander, soaked sweat from fever, and the faint metallic smell of blood flowing from broken lips. You inhale unwillingly, with each breath in your chest. In this air, the tent seemed even smaller, as if the disease itself had intensified the atmosphere. Imagine the camp in the state. The men huddled together, covering their cloaks and coughing, their faces pale in the dim light. Some people refused to leave the fire, and their bodies even trembled violently beside the charcoal. The horse stomped its feet uneasily, as if realizing that the people around it weren't watering. From above, the camp remained the same, with rows of tents and wisps of smoke rising. But in every shelter, disease does not remain silent. However, people still found a way to joke around. A soldier was coughing so severely that he almost fainted. He muttered to himself that at least his enemy would smell his breath and then run away. Another person was panting and singing, each note interrupted by a cough, until the laughter faintly echoed in the tent. Humor cannot heal, but it can loosen the shackles of despair, even if only for a moment. You wrapped the cloaked bite and pressed it, against your mouth as if it could filter the air. Every time you breathe, you feel chest pain, but you tell yourself it's just smoke, just fatigue, not illness. You close your eyes, even though the cough continues around you, filling the tent like a second wind. In this restless rest, you become aware of the truth that every medieval soldier knew. Survival is by no means merely about keeping warm. This is to keep the disease away until another dawn is seen. The cough hasn't gone away, that sleep still wears you down. In the darkness you find yourself dreaming of warmth. It's not true warmth, not fire, not cape, nor leather coat, but the memories of it, the way it once shone in the fireplace at home, the smell of toasted bread, and the soft weight of the feather mattress. You woke up for a while and realized how cruel thoughts can be. It offers you comfort in your dreams, but when you open your eyes and see the damp tent and cold breathing, it takes it away. The works of medieval soldiers and those who recorded them often mention dreams and visions at night. Some people claim that they dreamed of the banquet so vividly that when they woke up, they tasted the meat with their tongues. Others admit that their mothers, wives or lovers appear in their sleep, whispering words to help them get through the cold. In the harshest battles, these memories became stronger than reality, so much so that some people swore that they could smell their own fireplaces through the stench of smoke and straw. Some strange fragments of folk tales have quietly entered the record. The soldiers told the stories of some people. What they dreamed of was not food or warmth, but strange fires that would never go out. It is said that the sacred flame will follow the army to ensure survival. Some people think that these dreams are omens. Others, however, insist that they are merely half-minus frozen fever illusions. Imagine waking up in the dark, thinking you have been warmed by a sacred flame, only to find chilblains on your toes. Modern scholars hold different opinions on how much importance should be given to the descriptions of these dreams. Some people think that they are the exaggerations or literary exuberances of historians' eagerness to romanticize suffering. Others, however, believe that they reflect the true psychological survival mechanism, where the brain evokes warmth and abundance because the body lacks both. For these dreams, historical facts are metaphors of endurance. This problem lingers like smoke in a closed tent. You pulled your cloak tighter, closed your eyes, and tried to evoke your memories of warmth. Perhaps it was the fire in your childhood, or the thick quilt you once hid beneath, when the storm howled outside. But the harder you try, the stronger the feeling before your eyes becomes, minus the damp smell of wool, the pain in your joints, and the coughing of the man beside you. Memories are flickering, yet they can't hide the chill around you in the tent. Murmuring dreams echo, and whispered about a meat pie, his lips making smacking sounds in his sleep. Another person kept repeating a woman's name over and over again, and his voice turned into a SOB. Some others suddenly shouted and screamed, were awakened by nightmares, and then cursed while others were moaning. Dreams are woven like smoke in the tent. Everyone's heart is creating its own vulnerable refuge. The air inside was thick, a mixture of sweat, smoke and the faint sweetness of straw, now crushed by dozens of restless corpses. You are breathing rapidly, half-minus hoping that the warm memories will linger on your tongue. You will realize that here, what keeps people alive is not just the clenching fire, but the tenacious persistence in the feeling of warmth, even if only in sleep. Imagine the camp from a distance. The tent spread out under the moonlight. Everyone was holding a pile of corpses and dreaming of an ominous existent fire. Outside, the frost on the ground was glittering. Inside, people were twitching and muttering, clinging tightly to fantasies that were stronger than their tattered clothes. To any observer, this seems like a disaster. For the people inside, this is also survival. You closed your eyes again, determined to grasp that glimmer of warmth, even if it was false. Let your thoughts wander to the imagined fireplace, to the laughter at the dining table, to the light of the fireplace. Although your body lay stiffly on the straw, your spirit floated in your memory for a while, borrowing comfort from a distant world. The dream vanished, and when you opened your eyes, you understood something that had been being built all along. Survival in these tents has never been just about wool, fire or straw shards. When the cold comes from all directions, the will to persevere has always been the key. You look around and see people still breathing and still moving under their cloaks. You realize that endurance is both mental and physical. The materials of medieval battles repeatedly emphasize that morale is as important as food and fuel. Commanders wrote that an army wearing a warm cloak but mentally collapsed might collapse faster than one that was half-starved but still laughing. The cold night spent in the tent not only tested the body's recovery ability, but also the spirit. Every morning, men have to convince themselves that it is worth surviving. Sometimes they use unexpected methods. It was reported that the jokes told by the soldiers were so vulgar or absurd that they laughed so hard that tears dropped onto their cheeks. Some people worst as singing the lullabies from their childhood, their voices hoarse but firm. Some people even play some simple games, rolling dice in straw and carving patterns on canvas walls. But as long as the pain can be turned into a routine matter, these small acts sew in the fabric of the soul, which the cloak itself cannot provide. Historians are still debating which is more important, the physiological strategy or the psychological strategy for survival. Some people think that having no charm, no singing and no memory can fight against frostbite. Others insist that it is precisely these fragile spiritual rituals that enable the soldiers to get through difficult times, wake up at dawn and march again. Is it because their cloaks hold up, or because their hearts refuse to break that people can endure? The answer remains slippery, just like smoke escaping through the gaps of a tent. You pull your cloak tighter, not only to keep warm, but also to shield your thoughts around you. The body keeps moving. A person snores very loudly. Another one prayed softly. Another one moaned in his sleep. The tent was blown down by the wind, but it still stood upright. Close your eyes, take a deep breath and inhale the smoke, wool and moisture. All of this is unpleasant, but all of this proves that you are still here. Imagine the camp when dawn comes for the last time. Fire was in the drainage ditch. Smoke was drifting in the pale light. Horses were stomping their feet, and their breaths were steaming. The men staggered out of the tent, their shoulders bent, their eyes reddened, their armor stiff from the cold. From a distance, it looks like pain. Up close, it turns out to be a miracle. These people endured. They fell asleep half cold. They woke up feeling pain. They are still rising. You realize that lying in the corner of the straw, the real weapon to resist freezing to death has always been stubbornness. The cloak was torn apart, the straw otted, and the flames crackled. But the will to keep moving forward, step by step, night after night, endured the cold. This is the reason why soldiers survived in the Middle Ages. It's not because their tents are sturdy, but because their faults are stronger than frost. So now, when you let yourself fall asleep, imagine the flickering light of a medieval campfire gradually fading away in the embers. The tent was low and tiring. The canvas was patched and drooping. However, they still protected their tired bodies curled up under their cloaks. You can hear rhythmic snoring, occasional coughing, and low cries in the smoke-filled darkness. Outside, frost quietly gathered on the ropes and poles. But deep down, people stubbornly hold on to each other, to memories, and to the warm fragments. How they sat trapped in wool, relied on their comrades in arms, guarded with fragile fires, and even relied on their faith minus. These stories tell us more than just military history. It reminds us that survival is never perfect. It's about seeking enough warmth, enough laughter, and enough faith to get through the night. Every drop of water dripping from the canvas, every fleek rolling on the skin, and every gust of cold wind flinging the wings are all another kind of test. However, dawn always comes and soldiers always get up. Tonight, as you lie under your own blanket, you might imagine yourself in that tent. You can almost feel the rough wool scratching your cheek. Listen to the canvas being pulled in the wind. Smell the smoke seeping into the fabric. But you can also sense the silent determination that holds them together. Never yield to the cold. The fragile courage to close your eyes and believe that morning will come. So slow down your breathing. Make your body more supple. Cold and noise belong to another time, another place. Stay away from you. Now that you're safe, the outside world can wait. Sleep like those soldiers, not in comfort but in patience, because you know you have passed the toughest time.